"Marry me," the stranger said, "and every debt disappears by morning." Abigail Turner stared at the man's dusty boots-worn jacket, the kind of face that had never seen the inside of a bank, and laughed. Not because it was funny, because her father was coughing blood in the next room. Deputies were nailing notices to her gate, and a broke drifter was standing in her yard offering to save everything. "You don't have that kind of money," she said. He looked at her with calm, steady eyes. "No," he said quietly. "I have more." If this story already has your heart subscribed to our channel, follow every part until the very end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The foreclosure notice was still warm from the printer when Abigail pulled it off the gatepost. She didn't read past the first line. She already knew what it said. 48 hours. Everything her father had built, the pastures, the cattle pens, the barn her grandfather raised with his own hands. All of it going to auction unless someone produced $1,160 by Friday morning. $1,160. She'd been awake since before dawn doing the arithmetic in her head, and every time she ran the numbers, they came out the same. The savings account held $42 and change. The livestock wasn't worth selling in this market. The hay crop had burned in July. And the Bank First Territorial of Casper had already told her mother there would be no extension. Her mother was inside making broth. Not because Thomas Turner wanted it, because Margaret Turner didn't know what else to do when the world was falling apart, and soup was the only thing that felt like control. Abigail folded the notice and put it in her apron pocket. She was 26 years old, and she was already deciding which parts of her life she could let go of. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A single set of hooves on the dry road, unhurried, steady, the kind of pace that belonged to a man who wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. She turned and watched him come through the gate she'd left open for the deputies. She knew him. Everyone in the county knew Colt Walker more or less. Not well. Nobody knew him well. But you saw him around at the feed store, at the stockyard, hired out to this ranch or that one for seasonal work. He was the kind of man people looked past. Big through the shoulders, quiet in a way that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't warm either. Wore the same canvas jacket every season. Rode a horse that was solid but not flashy. Nobody talked about Colt Walker because there wasn't much to say. He worked, he drifted, he kept to himself. He pulled up in her yard and swung down from the saddle in one easy motion. "Miss Turner." "Mr. Walker." She crossed her arms. "If you're here about the pasture work, we're not hiring." "I'm not here about work." She waited. He turned his hat in his hands once slowly, and looked at her with those flat, serious eyes. Not unkind, just steady in a way that made her feel like the ground was slightly less solid beneath her feet than she'd thought. "I heard what happened with the bank," he said. "Half the county heard. I'd like to help." She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "You're sweet to say so, Mr. Walker, but I don't see how—" "I'll pay the debt." He said it the way you'd say the sky is blue, or it'll rain tomorrow. Flat. Certain. Every cent. By morning. The silence that followed was enormous. Abigail opened her mouth, closed it, looked at his worn boots, the fraying at his collar, the horse that hadn't been reshod in at least one season. Then she looked at his face, and something in his expression made her chest do a slow, uncomfortable turn. He was not joking. "That's $1,100, she said carefully. $1,160. You know the exact number." "I do." Where would you—" She stopped herself. She took a breath. "Mr. Walker, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but if you've got savings somewhere, spending them on our debt isn't—" "There's a condition." Everything in her went still. He held her gaze, didn't fidget, didn't look away. "Marry me," he said. "Legal proper before the bank opens Friday. You get the debt cleared and your family keeps the land. I get—" He paused. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and difficult to name. "I get a wife." She actually laughed. It came out sharp and short, the way a laugh does when there's nothing funny happening. "You're serious," she said. Yes. You want to marry me? Yes. You, a man who works seasonal cattle jobs and couldn't afford new boots last winter, want to walk into First Territorial Bank and lay down $1,160. By morning. By morning. She stared at him. And in exchange, you want me to be your wife. Legal and proper, he said again. You'd have your own room, your own space. I'm not asking for... He stopped, started again. It would be an arrangement, honest and fair. Your parents keep the ranch. You don't lose anything that belongs to your family. I'd lose myself, she said, and the words came out harder than she intended. He didn't flinch. That's your call to make. Ooh. Why? She took a step toward him. Why would you do this? You don't know me. We've said maybe 30 words to each other in our entire lives. 24, he said quietly. She blinked. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest trace of what might have been embarrassment there, and gone so fast she wasn't sure she'd seen it. I've counted them, he said, over the years. She told him no. She told him clearly, directly, and without leaving room for argument. She thanked him for the offer, told him it was inappropriate and possibly the strangest thing anyone had ever proposed to her, and asked him to get back on his horse. He nodded once, put his hat on. If you change your mind, he said, I'll be at the Millard boarding house until Thursday night. Then he rode away. Abigail went inside. She found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with the broth untouched in front of her, staring at her hands. And she heard from the back room the sound of her father coughing. Not a mild cough. The wet, tearing kind that had been getting worse since May. The kind the doctor in Cheyenne had pulled her aside to talk about in a very quiet voice, using words she hadn't been ready to hear. She sat down across from her mother. Mama! She folded the foreclosure notice flat on the table between them. I need you to tell me honestly. Is there anyone else? Any family? Any money anywhere we haven't thought of? Margaret. Turner looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. That was the answer. Abigail didn't sleep. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and had arguments with herself that went in circles and never landed anywhere useful. She thought about pride. She thought about what her father would say if he knew. She thought about the way Colt Walker had looked at her. Not desperate, not pleading. Not the way a man looks when he wants something he knows he shouldn't want. Steady. Patient. Like a man who had already accepted being told no and was at peace with whatever came next. 24 words. She hadn't counted. She wouldn't have thought to count. By 3 a.m, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing down every conversation she could remember having with Colt Walker. 6 years of passing in a county that wasn't large. At the stockyard when her father was still buying cattle. At the mercantile. At the church social 3 summers ago where she'd asked him to pass the salt, and he had. She counted 23. She stared at the number for a long time. Then she added the one from today. 24. He hadn't made that up. He'd been paying attention quietly from a distance for years. She didn't know what to do with that. She folded the paper, set her pencil down, and walked to the back room to check on her father. Thomas Turner was awake. He was always awake in the small hours the pain or the cough or both kept him from proper sleep. He looked up when she came in, and she saw on his face the thing he was always trying to hide from her. The guilt. The grief of a father who couldn't fix what was broken. You should be sleeping, he said, his voice rough and low. So should you. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand. His fingers were thin. She remembered when they'd been thick with work. Daddy, she said, there's a man who's offered to pay the bank. His eyes went careful. What man? Colt Walker. A long pause. Walker. The one who... The drifter. Yes. What does he want? She told him. She watched her father's face while she talked, the way his jaw went tight. The way his eyes moved to the window, the way he breathed slowly and carefully through what she was saying, the way he always did when he was deciding something important. When she finished, the room was quiet for a while. "I won't ask you to do that," Thomas said finally. "I know you won't. But I also won't pretend I know how we get through this another way." His voice was steady, but she could hear the effort in it. "Your mother after I'm gone, your mother—" "Don't." "Abigail." He squeezed her hand. "I need you to think about your mother." She already was. She had been thinking about nothing else since she sat down at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with a piece of paper and a pencil. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against her father's hand. "I hate this," she whispered. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault. It's not yours either." He stroked her hair once slowly. "Whatever you decide, it's not a failure. Doing what you have to do for the people you love is never a failure." She stayed there for a while in the dark. Then she stood up, kissed his forehead, and went to find her coat. The Millard boarding house was 8 miles. She made it in just under an hour and a half on the old mare, arriving as the sky was just beginning to go gray at the edges. She knocked on the door of the rooming house before the landlady was awake, and had to wait on the porch for 10 minutes before anyone answered. She told the woman she needed to speak to Mr. Walker. She was told to wait in the parlor. She sat in a straight-back chair with her hat in her lap and her hands folded and tried very hard to look like a woman who had made a calm, rational decision, rather than a woman who had ridden 8 miles in the dark and was quietly terrified. Colt Walker came downstairs in his work clothes, already dressed as though he'd been awake for hours. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. And he didn't say, "I knew you'd come," or "I thought you'd change your mind," and she was grateful for that more than she expected. "Miss Turner," he said. "I have conditions," she said. He stepped into the parlor and pulled the door mostly shut behind him. "All right. My own room. Always. That doesn't change." "Agreed. My mother gets to visit any time she wants for as long as she wants, no questions." "Agreed. If this arrangement stops working for either of us, we discuss it like adults and we find a solution that doesn't leave anyone without dignity." He nodded. "That's fair. And I need to know—" She hesitated. This was the one she'd been circling around for 8 miles in the dark. "I need to know why. The real reason. Because a man who counts words doesn't do something this large without a reason." He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down across from her, not beside her, across maintaining the distance, and put his hat on his knee, and looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. "I've been watching the Langford situation," he said. "Victor Langford has been working his way through this valley for 3 years. Buying debt, calling loans, taking land from families who don't have the leverage to fight back. Your family's ranch sits between 2 parcels he's already acquired." Abigail's spine straightened. "He wants our land." "He already has someone at the bank. Your loan wasn't called by accident." The cold that moved through her wasn't surprise. It was fury, quiet and deep. "That's why you're doing this." "Partly," he said. "I won't lie to you about that. Langford and I have a long history, and putting his plans sideways would give me satisfaction." "And the other part?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm 34 years old," he said. "I've built something considerable, and I've spent the last several years doing it alone." He paused, seemed to weigh something. "You're the kind of person who gets up before dawn to solve a problem that isn't solvable, who takes care of sick parents without being asked, who doesn't collapse when things fall apart." He stopped. "That's rare. I've been paying attention for 6 years because it's rare." Abigail held his gaze. "That's the most words you've ever said to me at once," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Almost a smile. Not quite. "Don't get used to it." She stood up, held out her hand. "We have a deal, Mr. Walker." He stood and took it. His grip was firm and warm. "Colt," he said. She held his hand a beat longer than necessary. "Abigail," she said. The wedding was Thursday afternoon. Small. A minister a witness the minister's wife provided, and Margaret Turner, who cried through the whole thing while trying very hard not to show that she was crying. Thomas Turner was too ill to attend. But Abigail sat with him for an hour that morning before the ceremony, and when she stood to leave, he had held her hand for a long time without speaking. His eyes said everything his voice couldn't manage. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The minister said the words. Colt said his. Abigail said hers. They signed the register. The minister's wife threw a small handful of dried lavender that was meant to be festive. Abigail Turner became Abigail Walker in 11 minutes. She spent most of those minutes studying the pattern on the church floor and reminding herself to breathe. After in the churchyard with Margaret weeping quietly into a handkerchief and the afternoon light sitting flat and gold on the dry street, Colt stood beside her and said very quietly, "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but I'll manage." He nodded. Fair enough. He helped her mother into the small wagon he'd borrowed, then helped Abigail up. He climbed to the driver's seat and picked up the reins, and they moved out through the edge of town toward the road north, toward the mountains, away from everything she had ever known. She had expected maybe an hour of travel. They rode for 3.5 hours. The road left the main valley, climbed through switchbacks in the foothills, crossed a ridge she hadn't known existed, and dropped into a remote valley that opened up between two mountain ranges like a secret kept by the land itself. She had never been out this far. She hadn't known there was anything out this far. She watched the landscape change around them and didn't ask questions, partly because her mother was asleep against her shoulder, partly because she was beginning to feel with increasing certainty that she had not entirely understood what she had agreed to. The road improved as they went. That was the first thing she noticed. This far-out roads weren't maintained. They were ruts and luck. But this road grew smoother, wider, better surfaced, as though someone had put real money into it. Then they came around a long curve in the valley floor, and Colt pulled the wagon to a stop. He didn't say anything. He just waited. Abigail looked at what lay ahead. Iron gates. Enormous. Set into a stone wall that ran in both directions farther than she could see, and beyond the gates a long drive lined with mature cottonwood trees, and at the end of it, a house. No, not a house. An estate. Stone construction. 3 stories, a wide porch running the full front length. Behind it, barns and outbuildings, and what looked like mill structures set along a creek. Pastures running out in every direction, cattle grazing in numbers she couldn't quickly estimate. Fencing that went on and on across the valley floor. Abigail sat very still. She heard her mother make a small, stunned sound. "Colt," Abigail said. Her voice came out very controlled and very quiet. "Whose property is this?" He had the reins loose in his hands. He was looking at the gate, not at her. "Mine," he said. The word landed like a stone in still water. She turned and looked at him. His profile, the worn jacket, the ordinary boots. The man that everyone in the county knew as a drifter, a seasonal hand, the cowboy who always looked like he was one bad month from having nothing. "Explain," she said. He clicked to the horse. The wagon moved forward. "I will," he said. "But let's get inside first." And as the iron gates swung open, someone had been watching. Someone was already there to open them. Staff she hadn't seen. Abigail Walker sat in the wagon with her hands folded in her lap and understood with absolute clarity that the man sitting next to her was not who anyone in the territory believed him to be, not even close. And she had just legally tied herself to him. The wagon rolled through the gates. The estate stretched around her on every side, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the shock and the fury that was already beginning to build, was something she didn't expect, something that felt almost against her will, like the first spark of genuine curiosity. "Who are you?" She hadn't said it out loud, but she was going to. The gates closed behind the wagon, with a sound Abigail felt in her chest. Heavy iron meeting heavy iron, a finality that had nothing to do with metal. She sat straight-backed and silent as the wagon rolled up the long drive. her eyes moving across everything, cataloging the way her brain always worked when it was trying to make sense of something it hadn't been built to handle. Staff came out to meet them. 3 men from the stables, a woman in an apron who looked like she ran the house, a young boy who took the horse's bridle without being asked. Everyone moved with the easy familiarity of people who had done this 100 times. Nobody seemed surprised. Nobody seemed uncertain. They had known he was coming home. They had not known he was bringing a wife. She could see it in the way the housekeeper's eyes moved to her quick professional revealing nothing, and then back to Colt with a question that was never spoken aloud. Colt climbed down and came around to help her mother first. He did it with the same unhurried steadiness he did everything, offering his hand, making sure Margaret was steady on her feet before he turned to Abigail. Abigail stepped down on her own. He noticed. He didn't comment. "Ruth," he said to the housekeeper, "this is my wife Abigail, and her mother, Mrs. Turner. Please make the guest room on the east end ready for Mrs. Turner. She'll be staying the night." Ruth, somewhere in her 50s with the kind of face that kept its own counsel, turned to Abigail and gave a nod that was almost a small bow. "Mrs. Walker, welcome to the estate. Mrs. Walker, Mrs. Fizz." Abigail heard it land on her like something dropped from a height. She smiled at Ruth because Ruth had done nothing wrong and followed them through the front door. The inside of the house hit her the same way the outside had, not with luxury exactly, but with solidity. Everything was built to last. Good wood, good stone, good light from tall windows. It was not a showpiece. It was a home that had been made carefully over time by someone who thought about what they were building. There were no portraits on the walls, no trophies, no display of wealth, just a house that knew what it was. Margaret made a small sound beside her that Abigail understood completely. Ruth showed her mother to the east room, and for a moment Abigail and Colt were alone in the main hallway, and the quiet between them was different from any quiet they'd had before. Heavier. Loaded with everything she hadn't said in the wagon. "You could have told me," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "If I had, would you have married me for the right reasons?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "Or would you have married the money?" he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. She looked at him for a long moment, and the fury she'd been holding carefully in check shifted slightly, not dissolving, but changing shape into something more complicated. "Show me the books," she said. He blinked. Of everything she might have said, that had not been what he expected. "The account books," she said. "The ranch ledgers, the contracts, whatever you use to run this operation. If I'm your wife, I need to understand what I've married into." He was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted, and then something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly. Closer to recognition. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight," she said. He studied her face. "Tonight," he agreed. They sat across from each other at the long table in the study, with 3 ledgers between them, and a lamp turned up high, and Colt Walker talked about his empire in the same flat factual tone he used for everything else. She listened and asked questions, and he answered them. And somewhere in the second hour of that conversation, Abigail Turner understood that she had significantly underestimated the man sitting across from her. The estate was not an inheritance. It was not luck. It was not a single stroke of good fortune. It was 11 years of relentless, deliberate work. He'd started at 19 with a seasonal job, and $200 he'd saved from 3 years of drifting. He'd bought a small timber lease in the Upper Valley, not because it was glamorous, but because nobody else wanted it. He'd worked it himself for 2 years, reinvested every dollar, bought a second lease, then a cattle parcel, then mineral rights on a ridge that turned out to have more value than anyone realized. He'd built forward always quietly, always below everyone's attention, never borrowing more than he could cover, never expanding faster than he understood. He now owned 4,200 acres of deeded land in the valley, 300 head of cattle, a working timber mill, water rights on 2 creeks, and a house that had taken 4 years to build because he'd refused to rush it. "Why the disguise?" she asked. He turned a page in the ledger. Didn't look up immediately. When I had nothing? He said people treated me like I was nothing. When I started to have something, people treated me like I was a problem to be solved. Business partners who wanted a piece. Women who appeared from nowhere. Men who had ignored me for years suddenly wanting to be my friend. He paused. I learned very quickly that money changes how people see you, and I didn't want to be seen that way. So you kept dressing like a drifter. It's not a costume, he said, and there was the first edge she'd heard in his voice. I work this land with my hands. I know every man who works for me by name and by family. I don't wear wealth because I don't think wealth is the point of any of this. She looked at him across the ledger. Then what is the point? She asked. He closed the book slowly, looked at her directly. I don't know yet, he said. I'm still figuring that out. It was the most honest thing she'd ever heard a man say, and it wrong-footed her completely. She'd been ready to argue with arrogance. She hadn't prepared for honesty. She looked back down at the ledger. Your accounts receivable on the timber contracts are running behind by about 40 days, she said. Somebody's not paying on time and you're not chasing them. He said nothing for a moment. Briggs Mill, he said. On the East Ridge lease. How long? 8 months. She stared at him. 8 months behind and you haven't sent a letter. I sent 2. And? Nothing. She pulled the ledger closer and ran her finger down the column. This is $430 sitting uncollected. She looked up at him. I'll write the letter tomorrow. Something shifted behind his eyes. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. But you're my husband, and $430 is $430. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not gratitude, exactly. Not surprise, exactly. Something between the two that she didn't have a name for yet. All right, he said quietly. She closed the ledger and stood up. Good night, Colt. Good night, Abigail. She went to her own room as agreed down the east hall, and lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling of a house she did not know, married to a man she did not know in a valley she had never seen before today. And she found to her great surprise that she was not frightened. She was thinking about the accounts receivable. Yet, the days that followed moved in a rhythm she hadn't expected. She had come prepared for awkwardness, for the strained silence of two strangers sharing space they'd negotiated rather than chosen. She had come prepared to feel like a guest in someone else's life, or worse, a transaction walking through hallways that didn't know her name. What she had not prepared for was Colt Walker at 5 a.m. in the barn forking hay, alongside 3 hired hands and arguing cheerfully with a man named Pete about the best way to brace a fence post. She'd gone to the barn that first morning because she couldn't sleep past 4:30. She never could at home, and she'd stood in the doorway and watched her husband work, and he hadn't noticed her for a full minute and a half, and in that minute and a half she'd seen something she understood. He was the same person here as he was anywhere. The house didn't change him. The land didn't puff him up. He moved through his wealth the way water moves through rock, completely without performance. When he finally saw her, he straightened. You're up early, he said. I'm always up early. She looked around the barn. What needs doing? He blinked. I mean what actually needs doing, she said. Not what's being handled. What's the problem that's been sitting too long because nobody's gotten to it? Pete, leaning on a pitchfork nearby, looked between the two of them with open interest. Colt said, the supply contracts for winter feed. We're getting quoted higher prices than we should be because we're not buying in large enough blocks. Who's the supplier? Garrison Feed out of Cheyenne, running through a middleman in town. Cut the middleman, she said. I'll write directly to Garrison today. If we're committing to a volume contract, they'll deal with us directly. Colt looked at her for a moment. Pete, he said without looking away from her. Yeah, boss. Mrs. Walker's going to need desk space in the study? Pete grinned. Yes, sir. She wrote 4 letters that first week, The Briggs Mill letter, firm and specific with a deadline and a statement about legal remedy that she'd borrowed the language for from a contract template she found in Colt's files. The Garrison feed letter, direct and professional, with a proposed volume commitment and a request for their best long-term rate. A letter to the county land office asking for copies of 2 boundary surveys that Colt had mentioned didn't match each other, and a letter to her mother, which was different from all the others, because she had to stop twice while writing it to collect herself. The Briggs Mill payment arrived in 9 days. She was in the study when the writer brought it. Colt was out on the east pasture. She processed the payment, entered it into the ledger, and set the receipt in the folder she'd labeled "Accounts Resolved with the particular satisfaction of someone who has set a crooked thing straight." When Colt came in that evening, she showed him. He looked at the payment, looked at the ledger entry, looked at her. 9 days, he said. I was specific about consequences, she said. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. She'd made it her desk. Now, she'd simply begun thinking of it that way, and leaned back and looked at the ceiling. Garrison came back with a rate 14% below what we're paying now, he said. Their letter came in this afternoon. She kept her expression neutral. I know. I read it. He brought his gaze back down from the ceiling and looked at her. What would I have done without you, he said, and he said it in a tone that wasn't quite joking and wasn't quite serious, but landed somewhere in the middle that felt genuine. Paid full price for winter feed for another 5 years, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. She looked down at the ledger, so she didn't have to figure out what to do with the warmth that had just moved through her chest. 2 weeks in, she met Eleanor Langford. She hadn't planned to. She'd ridden into town with Colt to file the Garrison contract at the notary, a straightforward errand on a Tuesday morning, and they were coming out of the notary's office when Eleanor Langford stepped out of the millinery next door with a woman Abigail didn't recognize. Eleanor was 23 and looked like someone had painted her carefully. Everything arranged, nothing accidental. She wore clothes that didn't belong to Wyoming. She stopped when she saw them, and her eyes moved from Colt to Abigail and back again, with an expression that was working very hard to be pleasantly neutral and not quite getting there. Colt, she said. Warm and familiar the way you say someone's name when you want an audience to know you have access to it. Eleanor, he said. Her gaze settled on Abigail with a smile that was perfectly constructed. And you must be the new wife. Everyone in town is talking. She said everyone in town is talking the way you'd say what a shame about the weather. Abigail Walker, Abigail said pleasantly. You're Victor Langford's daughter. I am. Eleanor tilted her head. Daddy said he didn't know Colt was even considering marriage. We were all quite surprised. A small pause. Colt tends to keep to himself. He's very good at that, Abigail agreed. Something moved behind Eleanor's careful smile. I do hope you're settling in well. The valley takes some getting used to, especially for someone from... Another small pause, deliberate as a knife, further down the mountain. I'm settling in very well, thank you. Abigail smiled back just as carefully. I've been reorganizing the account books. Fascinating what you find when you look closely at how things have been run. Eleanor's smile stayed in place, but her eyes went sharp. How lovely, she said. Enjoy your morning, Abigail said, and walked to the wagon. Colt fell into step beside her. He said nothing until they were in the wagon and out of earshot. That was well done, he said. I don't know what you mean, she said. He actually smiled then, a full one, brief and real gone, almost before it arrived. She felt it hit her somewhere in the solar plexus, and said nothing. That evening, for the first time, he told her about Victor Langford. Not the surface version she'd known. The surface version for years, everyone in the county did. Victor Langford, richest cattle baron in the territory, built his empire on smarts and hard work, and the kind of business instincts that made other men feel slow. That was the story Victor told, and Victor paid people to keep telling. The real story was something different. Colt told her at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them in the unhurried way he had of saying things that mattered. No drama, no embellishment, just the facts laid out flat so you could look at them clearly. Victor had moved into the valley 12 years ago, same period Colt was starting to put together his first timber lease. Back then, the valley had 12 working ranches. Families who'd been there a generation, who'd built something on difficult land through difficult years. Now, there were 4. He buys debt, Colt said. Quietly. He finds who the bank has on the line, and he buys the notes before the family knows anyone's looking. Then he calls the loan. Not all at once, he's not stupid. He spaces it. Gives people just enough time to scramble so nobody can prove a pattern, and when the land goes to auction, he's there. Your water rights, Abigail said, thinking out loud. He needs them. My water rights feed the whole upper valley. Without them, the eastern parcels he's been buying up don't function as a cattle operation. They're just land. So you're the last piece. I'm the piece that makes everything else work, he said. He's been trying to get at me for 4 years. He can't buy my debt because I don't carry any. He can't find a pressure point because I've kept my life simple. He paused. Until now. She heard the weight in those 2 words. Until now. He'll come at us through me, she said quietly. Not a question. Yes. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. He's the one who had our bank loan called. I believe so. I can't prove it yet. The boundary surveys that don't match, she said. The 2 records I requested from the land office. He looked at her. 2 of the 4 families who lost their land to Langford had boundary disputes right before their loans were called, she said. It's in your files. I found it 3 days ago. She paused. I think he's been manipulating land records. The silence that followed was long and very still. You found that in 3 days, Colt said. I find things, she said simply. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that appeared when she did something he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't condescension, and it wasn't surprise. It was something more careful than both of those. Abigail, he said slowly. How long have you been this smart? My whole life, she said. Nobody asked before. He held her gaze. I'm asking, he said. She felt something unlock in her chest, small, precise, like a door that has been stuck for a long time, finally finding its hinge. She looked down at her coffee cup because the moment was too direct for her to hold it steady. The land office records will arrive by the end of the week, she said. If I'm right about the boundary discrepancies, we have the start of something Langford can't talk his way out of. And if you're right, then we document everything, she said. Every family he pushed out. Every loan that got called right after a mysterious boundary dispute. Every auction where he happened to be the only bidder. She looked up. I grew up watching my father lose ground because he didn't know how to fight the right way. I'm done watching. Colt was quiet for a moment. The land office records, he said. I'll send a man tomorrow to move them up. I already sent the request. He blinked. Express post, she said. This morning when I was in town. He looked at her for a full 5 seconds. Good night, Colt, she said, standing and taking her cold coffee to the sink. Good night, Abigail, he said, and she could hear something different in his voice, something that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago when he'd first spoken her name in the parlor of the Millard boarding house. She didn't let herself think about what it was until she was behind her own door, and then she thought about it for longer than she intended. The land office records arrived on a Thursday. By Friday evening, she had laid every document on the study table in chronological order, cross-referenced against Colt's files, and 3 years of county auction records he'd kept in a box in the back storage room, and she had built a picture that made her set down her pen and sit very still for a moment. She called Colt in. He stood at the table, and she walked him through it. 5 families. 5 boundary disputes. All of them filed within 6 months of a loan being called. All of the disputes citing survey records that traced back to a single assessor's office in Cheyenne, the same office, the same 2 surveyors across a span of 7 years. and at every auction that followed Victor Langford. "He's not buying debt," she said. "Or not only buying debt, he's manufacturing the conditions to force the sale. He creates the boundary problem which spooks the bank, which either calls the loan or refuses to extend it, which forces the auction." Colt stood looking at the documents for a long time. "This is enough to take to a territorial judge," he said. "It's enough to start," she said. "We need testimony from the families. Someone who can speak to what happened from the inside. The documents show the pattern, but a judge is going to want a person." "I know 2 of the families," he said. "The Hargrove family is in Casper now. The Martins went to Colorado." He paused. "They might not want to come back. Langford has a long reach and people know it." "Then we have to make it safe enough for them to say yes," she said. He looked at her. "How?" he said. She thought about it, set her hand flat on the table over the documents, over the proof she had spent 4 days building out of a box of old records, and a gut feeling that 2 boundary surveys didn't match. "We don't go to him," she said. "We don't threaten him. We don't announce what we know. We don't give him any reason to move first." She looked up. "We build the case completely before he knows it exists, and then we walk it into a room full of people who can't be bought." "The territorial hearing," Colt said. "The Railroad Route Commission. It's scheduled for 8 weeks, she said. "I know. I read your correspondence files, too." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Almost. "You read my correspondence files?" "You left them in the study," she said. "If you didn't want me to read them, you should have used a locked drawer." He shook his head slowly. She began gathering the documents into careful stacks, precise and organized, because the work wasn't finished, and she had 8 weeks, and she intended to use every one of them. "Colt," she said without looking up. "Yes." "I need you to send for the Hargrove family." She paused. "Tell them Abigail Walker asked for them specifically. Tell them a woman is asking, not a cattle baron. It might matter." A long pause. "It will matter," he said quietly. She looked up then. He was watching her with that careful, unnameable expression. She held it 1 beat. Then she looked back at the documents. "Then let's not waste time," she said. The Hargrove family arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks after Colt sent the letter. Abigail was in the study when she heard the wagon come up the drive. She was in the middle of cross-referencing 2 sets of water rights documents, a tedious, eye-straining job that she'd given herself because nobody else was going to do it, and she set her pen down and went to the window without thinking. The way you do when your nerves have been running at a low hum for 3 weeks straight, and any sound feels like it could be the sound. She recognized the exhaustion on them immediately. Not road exhaustion. The other kind. The kind that doesn't wash off. Daniel Hargrove was somewhere in his 50s, built like a man who'd spent 30 years working land that fought back. His wife Clara moved beside him with the careful steadiness of someone who had learned to hold herself very still in unfamiliar places, because stillness was the only control she had left. They had a daughter with them, maybe 16, watching everything with eyes that had gone older than they should have. Colt brought them inside. Abigail put coffee on. She did not start with the documents. She started with food, because Clara Hargrove had looked at the kitchen table the way a person looks at something they hadn't expected to feel safe near. They ate. They talked about the road from Casper. They talked about the weather, which was the thing people talked about when they needed time to trust the room they were in. Abigail waited. It was Daniel who finally set his fork down and looked across the table at her. "Your letter said you found something," he said. "I did." "Something on Langford?" "Yes." He looked at his wife. Clara was looking at her coffee cup. Her jaw was set with the precise tension of someone fighting not to feel hope, because hope had cost them before. "Show me," Daniel said. Abigail brought the documents to the table. She walked them through it methodically, the same way she'd walked Colt through it. Chronological, factual, no embellishment needed, because the facts were damning enough on their own. The boundary dispute filed against the Hargrove property in April of 1885. The survey records citing the Cheyenne assessor's office. The loan called by First Territorial 6 weeks later. The auction in September, where the only bidder was a company called Western Valley Holdings, which, as Abigail had discovered 3 days ago, was a shell company whose registered agent was Victor Langford's personal attorney. By the time she finished, Clara Hargrove had tears running down her face and was not bothering to wipe them. Daniel's hands were flat on the table, pressing down hard. "I knew it," he said, and his voice was barely controlled. "I told Clara, I told her it wasn't right. Nobody's survey just changes, nobody's numbers, just shift like that. But the bank wouldn't listen, and the county office said the records were valid, and I didn't have." He stopped, pressed his hands harder. "I didn't have what you have right here." "You have it now," Abigail said. "What do you need from us?" "Your testimony," she said, "at the territorial hearing in 5 weeks, in front of the Railroad Route Commission, and every official in the territory who has any say over what happens in this valley." The silence at the table was the kind that people fill with the arithmetic of risk. Abigail knew that arithmetic. She'd done it herself at 3 in the morning with a pencil and a piece of paper. "Langford will come after us," Clara said quietly. Her first direct words of the conversation. Her voice was steadier than Abigail had expected. "If we testify and it doesn't hold, it will hold," Abigail said. "You can't promise that." "No," Abigail said. "I can't promise the outcome. I can promise the evidence is real and documented, and I will be standing next to you in that room." She paused. "But I won't lie to you about the risk. You deserve the truth more than you deserve false comfort." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," Clara said. "When we heard Colt Walker had gotten married, I thought everyone thought that I married him for the money," Abigail said. Clara didn't deny it. "Did you?" Abigail thought about a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, about 24 words counted over 6 years, about a man who said "I don't know yet" when she asked him what the point of all of it was. "I married him to save my family," she said honestly. "And then I found out who he actually was. And those are 2 different things that both happen to be true." Clara held her gaze for a beat. Then she looked at her husband. "Daniel," she said. He was already nodding. The Martins sent a letter 2 days later. They would come. They needed 2 weeks to arrange travel from Colorado, but they would come. Abigail read the letter twice, and then sat quietly for a moment with her hands in her lap. Colt found her like that. "Martins," he said, reading her expression. "They'll be here by the 18th. He sat down across from her. "That gives us 3 weeks before the hearing." "It's enough," she said. "I need one more thing." "What?" "The water rights dispute," she said. "Langford filed a competing claim on your Upper Creek rights 18 months ago. I found the filing in the county records. You have a response on file, but it's been sitting in review." He went very still. "I know about the filing. Did you know the reviewer assigned to it works for the same county office that processed 3 of Langford's fraudulent boundary disputes?" The stillness got deeper. "No," he said. "I found the connection yesterday." She slid a single page across the desk to him. Same signature. Different department, but same individual signing off on record amendments in both cases. His name is Gerald Pruitt. He's been in that office for 9 years. Colt looked at the page. His jaw was tight. "He's not just manipulating records," Colt said slowly. "He has someone inside the county system. Has had," Abigail said, "for at least 9 years. She paused. "Colt, how many families lost land in this county over the last 9 years?" He looked up at her. Neither of them said it aloud. They didn't need to. The number was larger than 5. She rode into town alone 3 days later, and she knew before she left that Colt wasn't comfortable with it. He didn't say so directly, that wasn't how he operated, but she saw it in the way he watched her saddle the horse, the way he started to say something twice, and stopped both times. "I'll be back before dark," she said. "I know that," he said. "Then what's the face for?" He was quiet a beat. "Langford knows we've been gathering information. He's not blind. Eleanor will have reported back. I know that too. Going into town alone right now makes me look like a woman running an ordinary errand, she said, which is exactly what Langford expects from me. That's why I'm going. She checked the cinch. If you ride with me, it signals that we're moving. I'd rather he thinks we're still in the early stages. Colt looked at her for a moment. Don't stop at the land office, he said. If Pruitt sees you in there... I'm not going to the land office, she said. I'm going to the mercantile, the post office, and I'm going to have lunch at Helda's counter the same as any Tuesday. He pressed his mouth together. Colt, she said, and her voice was gentler than she'd intended it to be. I grew up in this county. I know these streets. Let me use that. He looked at her for one more beat. Then he stepped back from the horse. Before dark, he said. Before dark, she agreed and rode. Helda's lunch counter was where the county talked to itself. Abigail had known that since she was 12 years old. She ordered coffee and a beef plate, and sat at the far end of the counter, where you could hear most of the room without appearing to listen, which was a skill she'd refined over 2 decades of being the rancher's daughter, who sat quietly while the men talked. She learned 3 things in an hour and 20 minutes. The first was that Victor Langford had been in town every day that week. That was unusual. He typically kept to his estate and sent representatives. Daily appearances meant he was managing something personally. The second was that there had been 2 strangers in town since Monday. Not ranch hands, not traders, not the kind of men with a destination. The kind who sat in the saloon and watched the street. The man next to her at the counter mentioned it to Helda without much concern, the way you mention something mildly odd that doesn't seem like your problem yet. Abigail finished her beef plate and thought about that for a moment. The third thing was the one that put her hand flat on the counter to steady herself. She overheard it from 2 men. 2 stools down, ranchers she recognized. Not Langford's people. Ordinary men having an ordinary conversation about a cattle drive scheduled for Saturday. Colt Walker's drive, the one he'd mentioned last week. Taking 300 head down through the pass to the Southern Stockyards 3-day trip, mostly the crew and Colt himself, because he always rode the drives personally. She paid for her lunch and rode home faster than she'd left. She found him in the barn. Cancel the drive, she said. He turned around from where he was checking a harness. Why? There are 2 men in town who don't belong there. They've been there since Monday. Langford's been in town personally every day this week. She held his gaze. The drive route goes through the pass. 3 days minimal crew, no communication with the estate. Colt set the harness down slowly. He knows about the hearing, she said. He knows we're building something. He can't get to the documents, but he can get to you. You don't know that's what... Colt. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. You have 4,000 acres, 300 head of cattle water rights that are the key to everything he's built in this valley, and in 5 weeks you're walking into a territorial hearing with documented evidence of his fraud. If he stops you before that hearing, then there's no case, Colt said quietly. There's no case, she said. He was quiet. She watched him work through it, the calculation, the pride of a man who had always ridden his own drives, and then the moment when the calculation won. I'll send Hendricks to lead it, he said. He's done it before. She let out a breath she'd been holding since Helda's counter. Good, she said. You should have taken someone with you into town, he said. It would have looked like... I know what it would have looked like, he said. I don't care what it looks like. Don't go alone again. She started to argue. He looked at her with an expression that was not commanding. It wasn't the tone of a man telling a woman what to do. It was the face of someone who was frightened for a person they couldn't afford to lose, and was saying so the only way he knew how. She closed her mouth. All right, she said. Something eased in his face. They stood in the barn for a moment, in the particular quiet that follows when 2 stubborn people have both decided to stop pushing at the same time. Thank you, he said. For what? For coming back before dark, he said. She looked at him. And something moved through her that she'd been carefully not naming for 3 weeks, quick and warm and entirely inconvenient. She turned and walked back toward the house. The cattle drive left Saturday without Colt. Abigail was at the study desk by 7 in the morning, working through the final organization of the testimony documents, when Pete came to the door and told her there was a rider coming up the drive fast. She was already standing when the rider came through the front door. It was one of the drive crew, a young man named Torres who was supposed to be 12 miles south in the pass. He was pale and out of breath, and his left sleeve was dark. "They hit us in the pass," he said. "6 men. Came out of the rocks." Abigail's voice came out level. "Where's Hendricks?" "Hendricks is okay. He sent me back." Torres swallowed hard. "Mrs. Walker, they weren't after the cattle. They let the cattle go right after. They went straight for the crew, like they were looking for someone specific. Like they were looking for someone who wasn't there." She turned to Pete, who was behind her in the doorway. "Get every man in from the east pasture. Now. Nobody rides out alone. Nobody opens the gate for anyone we don't know by name." She looked back at Torres. "How bad is your arm?" "It's not deep." "Come inside. Ruth will look at it." She was already moving past him, and the part of her that had been running quietly terrified for 2 weeks went very quiet and very cold, because cold was the only useful thing to be right now. She sent for Colt, who was in the upper timber section doing a quarterly check with the mill foreman. The rider found him in 40 minutes. He was back in under 2 hours. He came through the front door and stopped when he saw her face. "Torres is all right," she said immediately. "The crew is all right. Nobody dead." He let out a breath. "6 men in the pass," she said. "They released the cattle and went for the crew directly. They were looking for you." Colt stood very still. "If you'd been on that drive," she said, and stopped. She'd said it. That was enough. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped in front of her close enough that she had to look up at him, and he looked at her face for a long moment. "I wasn't," he said quietly. "I know. Because of you." She looked away. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was doing something about that by keeping them flat at her sides. "We need to go to this county sheriff," she said. "Today. This changes everything. This isn't land fraud anymore. This is Langford telling us he's done waiting," Colt said. His voice had gone flat in a way she hadn't heard before. Not cold exactly. Decided. "He panicked," she said. "Which means he knows about the evidence. Which means someone told him." "Who has access to your documents?" she thought. "Ruth knows I've been working on something. The Hargroves have seen part of it. Colt." She stopped. "Your correspondence. Before I reorganized the files. Is there anyone who would have regular access to the study?" He was quiet for a moment. "I had a bookkeeper last year," he said. "Local man. I let him go in January when I realized the accounts were getting behind in ways they shouldn't have been." His jaw tightened. "His name is Pruitt." "Gerald Pruitt," she said. "The county records man. What was your bookkeeper's name exactly?" A pause. "Edward Pruitt," he said. She felt the pieces align in her chest with a click that was almost physical. "Brothers," she said. "Or cousins. Or the same family, and it doesn't matter which." She pressed her hand to her sternum for a second. "Langford didn't just have someone in the county office. He had someone in your house. Feeding him information for how long did you have the bookkeeper?" 18 months. 18 months. She breathed through that. "Colt. He's known everything. The water rights response, the evidence I've been gathering if Pruitt reported back to his family. He knows what we have," Colt said. "He knows what we had as of January," she said. "The Hargroves came in after. The Martin letter came after. The water rights connection, I found that 2 weeks ago." She straightened. "He knows the shape of it, but not the full case. That's why they went for you instead of destroying the documents. Destroying the documents doesn't help him if we can rebuild from testimony alone. But if you're gone, then you're a widow with no standing and no resources," Colt said, and his voice had gone very quiet. and he can contest the estate and buy time and let everything fall apart. They looked at each other. He underestimated you, Colt said. He saw a woman alone with paperwork. He thought removing me was enough. He's never had to contend with someone who'd reorganized his entire filing system in 2 weeks, she said, and it came out with more edge than she'd intended. Colt looked at her for a moment, then quietly, urgently, like a man saying something he wasn't sure he'd say again. Abigail, are you all right? She opened her mouth to say yes. The word didn't come out. What came out instead was something closer to the truth. I'm frightened, she said. And I'm angry. And I'm not going to let either of those things stop me. He reached out and put his hand over hers, the one pressed flat against her sternum for one brief second. Just that. Then he stepped back. I'll send for the sheriff, he said. Send for the Hargroves too, she said. I want them inside this estate until the hearing. I want everyone we're counting on where I can see them. Done, he said. She pulled herself straight and picked up her pen from the desk. Then we have 4 weeks, she said. Let's make them count. The next 4 weeks were the most grueling of Abigail's life, and also in some ways she couldn't quite explain to herself the most alive she had ever felt. She wrote the final testimony brief for the Hargroves at the kitchen table, while Clara sat across from her checking dates. She rebuilt the Pruitt connection from scratch using records Langford couldn't know she'd obtained because she'd requested them through a land office in a different county, quietly using her maiden name. She cross-referenced the shell company Western Valley Holdings with 4 other auction records and found 2 more properties she hadn't known about. 7 families, not 5. She added them to the brief. The Martins arrived on a Wednesday 2 weeks before the hearing, and Frank Martin sat down at the study table and looked at what she'd built and said in a rough and tired voice, "You've done what I spent 3 years wishing someone would do." She looked at him across the table. "I had a reason to look," she said. He glanced toward the hallway, where Colt's voice could be heard talking to one of the crew. "He's a good man," Frank said. "Kept to himself too much, but a good man." "He is," Abigail said, and realized she meant it without reservation, without the careful qualification she'd been adding to the thought for weeks. He was a good man. And somewhere in 4 weeks of fear and work, and late nights, and one moment in the study, when he'd put his hand over hers for exactly 2 seconds, she had stopped thinking of this life as the arrangement she'd agreed to. She hadn't said so. She wasn't ready to say so. But she'd stopped pretending it wasn't true. The night before the hearing, she was still in the study at midnight when Colt came in. He set a cup of coffee beside her hand without being asked. She looked up at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "If this doesn't go the way we plan," she said, because she'd been a practical person her whole life, and she wasn't going to stop now. "If the commission won't hear the testimony, or if Langford has already gotten to someone in that room, then we go to the territorial court directly," he said. "I've already retained an attorney in Cheyenne," quietly. She hadn't known that. She should have known it was exactly what she would have done. "When?" she said. "Week 3, he said, "while you were working on the Martin testimony." She looked at him. "I find things too," he said, almost exactly the way she'd said it to him weeks ago. "I find things." Something moved through her face that she couldn't entirely control. She looked down at the documents. "We're ready," she said. "We are," he said. "If he pushes back in that room, if he tries to discredit the testimony, go after the Hargroves or the Martins." "He'll try," Colt said. "He's going to try everything." "Then we need to be faster," she said. "Not louder. Faster. Have the documents in front of the chair before he can respond. Don't let him set the pace of the room." Colt was watching her with that careful expression again. "You've been in a hearing before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My father went before the county water board 3 times, she said. "I went with him twice. He always let them talk too long and got behind the pace." She paused. "I'm not going to do that." "No," Colt said very quietly. "You're not." She finally looked at him directly. really looked at him the way she hadn't allowed herself to do very often, because looking at Colt Walker directly was a thing that required a kind of steadiness she was still building in herself. He was looking back. "Colt," she said. "Yes." "Whatever happens tomorrow." She stopped. Started again. "I don't regret any of it." He was quiet for a moment. "The marriage," he said carefully. "Any of it," she said. The lamp between them was low and warm, and the house was completely quiet. "Neither do I," he said. She held his gaze for one more beat. Then she squared the documents in front of her. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have a long day tomorrow." He stood, picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. "Abigail." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it." She held it. Didn't deflect it, didn't reduce it. "You're welcome," she said. He went. She sat alone in the quiet study with the lamp and the documents and the case they had built together, out of old records and late nights and $430 in recovered debt and the stubborn conviction that crooked things should be made straight. Tomorrow Victor Langford was going to find out exactly who he'd underestimated. She was looking forward to it. The territorial hearing hall was full by 8 in the morning. Abigail had not expected that. She had expected officials, commissioners, the railroad men from back east with their leather cases and their impatient schedules. She had expected Victor Langford and his attorney and whatever wall of legal language they'd spent the last 4 weeks building. She had not expected ranchers, farmers, women in work dresses sitting 3 to a bench, men she recognized from the county stockyard, from the feed store, from the edges of auctions she'd attended with her father. People who had driven hours on bad roads to sit in a government hall on a Thursday morning. Colt saw her expression when they walked in. "Word travels," he said quietly. "How many of them lost land to him? Some of them. The rest know someone who did." He held the door for the Hargroves and the Martins behind them. In a valley this size, Langford's reach touches everyone eventually. She held the folders tighter against her chest and moved through the crowd to the front table assigned to them. She set everything down in the precise order she'd packed it: testimony briefs on the left, survey documents in the center, the Shell Company records on the right, the Gerald Pruitt connection in a separate envelope she would deploy at the exact right moment. She had run the sequence in her head so many times she could do it asleep. She looked up at the commissioner's table. 3 men from the territorial government, one of whom she recognized from his photograph in the county newspaper as Commissioner Roland Hayes, appointed 18 months ago, reputation for running clean proceedings. She'd researched him specifically. He was the reason she'd chosen this hearing over filing directly with the territorial court. Hayes had a record of following evidence regardless of who it inconvenienced. She needed that today. Victor Langford arrived at 8:15 with 2 attorneys and Eleanor at his side. He moved through the hall with the practiced ease of a man who had walked into rooms like this many times and left them satisfied. He was 60, or close to it, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that communicated authority before he'd said a word. He glanced at the table where Abigail and Colt sat. His gaze passed over Colt and landed on Abigail. Stayed there for 2 seconds. Long enough to communicate that he had assessed her and arrived at a conclusion. She held his gaze. He looked away first. She filed that away and said nothing. The proceedings opened with the Railroad Commission's agenda: route options, land acquisition timelines, cost projections. Abigail sat through 40 minutes of it with her hands flat on the table and her attention split between the commissioners and the room behind her, which was growing louder in the particular way rooms grow loud when people are holding their patience by force of will. Langford's attorney presented his client's proposal for the southern route, which would cut directly through 3 parcels that Langford controlled and position him as the primary land partner for the entire railroad expansion. The presentation was polished and detailed and backed by 12 months of survey work. Commissioner Hayes nodded and made notes. Then he looked at the Walker table. "Is there a response to be entered into the record?" Abigail stood up. She heard the shift in the room behind her. the collective adjustment of 200 people straightening in their seats. "Yes, Commissioner Hayes," she said. "My name is Abigail Walker. I represent the Walker estate and the interests of 7 families who have property concerns bearing directly on the land acquisition decision before this commission." She picked up the first folder. "I'd like to begin with the land records if the commission will permit." Hayes looked at her steadily. "Proceed, Mrs. Walker." Langford's lead attorney was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. "Commissioner, this hearing concerns a railroad route determination, not a general land grievance proceeding. The Walker estate has no standing to introduce unrelated. The land being considered for the railroad route passes through parcels that were acquired through documented fraudulent means." Abigail said, her voice level and carrying. "That makes it directly relevant to the Commission's determination. The railroad cannot build on stolen land without liability. I believe the Commission's charter makes that clear." Hayes looked at the attorney. "Sit down, Mr. Calder. I'll determine relevance." He looked back at Abigail. "Continue." She heard someone in the room behind her exhale. She put the first survey document in front of Hayes. She went through it the way she'd planned, methodically, without drama, letting the facts carry their own weight. The boundary dispute filed against the Hargrove property in April 1885. The survey records. The loan called 6 weeks later. The auction where Western Valley Holdings was the only bidder. Then she put the shell company registration in front of Hayes. "Western Valley Holdings," she said, "is registered to a Mr. Albert Crane, who serves as registered agent for 17 companies in the territory, 14 of which trace their ownership through a single attorney, James Calder." She paused. "Who is seated at that table representing Victor Langford?" The room reacted. Not loudly. The intake of breath across 200 people was nearly silent, but she felt it. Calder was on his feet. "This is circumstantial and irrelevant, and I object to—" "You're not in a courtroom, Mr. Calder," Hayes said, with the tone of a man who has been interrupted once too often. "Sit down." He looked at the document, turned it over, looked at Abigail. "You're asserting that the attorney representing Langford is also the registered agent for companies used in land acquisitions that benefited Langford." "I'm presenting the documented record," she said. "The commission can draw its own conclusions." She moved to the next folder. The Hargroves came forward when she called them. Daniel Hargrove sat in the testimony chair and spoke in a rough, controlled voice about the morning. The bank called their loan about the boundary dispute. They'd never understood about the auction. They couldn't attend because they were loading their wagon to leave. Clara sat behind him, with her hands folded and her back straight, and when Daniel's voice cracked once, just once, on the word home, she closed her eyes and pressed her lips together and didn't look away. The room was completely silent. Langford was writing something on a paper in front of him and not looking at the Hargroves. The deliberateness of it, the performance of his disinterest, was the ugliest thing Abigail had seen in the hall that morning. The Martins went next. Frank Martin was less controlled than Daniel Hargrove, and more effective for it. He leaned forward in the testimony chair and addressed himself directly to Commissioner Hayes with the contained fury of a man who has waited years for the right room. "I want to know," Frank said, "how a man files a boundary dispute on my eastern fence line using a survey I've never seen processed by a county assessor I've never heard of, and 6 weeks later my banknote gets called by an institution I've been in good standing with for 11 years. I want someone in this room to explain that to me." Hayes said, "We're trying to do that, Mr. Martin." "Then explain it," Frank said, "because I drove 3 days from Colorado to hear the explanation." Hayes looked at Langford's table. "Mr. Langford, your attorney will have an opportunity to respond. I'd advise you to prepare something substantive." Calder's response took 20 minutes and accomplished almost nothing. He challenged the chain of custody on 2 documents correctly. Abigail noted in that she had obtained one of them through a secondary county office, rather than directly, which created a technical question. She had anticipated this. She stood up when Calder finished. "The document Mr. Calder is challenging was obtained through the Laramie County Records Office, not the Casper office, because the original was filed there as part of a 1884 regional land compilation. I have the request receipt and the archivist's certification." She put both on the table in front of Hayes. "The document is valid." Calder started to respond. Hayes held up one hand without looking at him. Hayes was reading the certification. Abigail waited. "This is in order," Hayes said. He set it down. "Continue, Mrs. Walker." She picked up the envelope she'd been saving. "I'd like to enter into the record the employment history of Gerald Pruitt, currently serving as a records reviewer in the Casper County Land Office." She placed the document in front of Hayes. "Mr. Pruitt processed 3 of the boundary dispute amendments I've referenced this morning. He also served as a records clerk in the Cheyenne Assessor's Office from 1879 to 1882, during which time he processed the original survey records used in 2 of those same disputes." She paused. "He is the brother-in-law of Edward Pruitt, who served as bookkeeper at the Walker estate from March of 1886 through January of this year." The room went very still. Hayes looked up slowly. "You're asserting a direct information chain." "I'm presenting the documented family connection and the documented professional overlap," she said. "The commission can draw its own conclusions." Langford spoke for the first time. He had not spoken since the proceedings began. His voice was measured and deep and carried the comfortable confidence of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 30 years. "Commissioner Hayes," he said, "I have built my business in this territory through legal acquisition, fair contracts, and honest dealing. What this woman is presenting is a collection of coincidences assembled by someone with a personal grievance and sufficient time on her hands to make them look like something they aren't." The room shifted. Abigail did not turn around. "This woman," Langford continued with precisely calibrated scorn, "married Colt Walker 6 weeks ago, under circumstances that the entire county found irregular. She has spent those 6 weeks digging through old records, looking for something, anything, to justify her presence in a business matter that is substantially beyond her experience or understanding." He paused. "I feel some sympathy for her situation," he said, "but sympathy is not a substitute for evidence." The silence that followed was the kind that a room holds when it's waiting to see which way something falls. Abigail turned around. She looked at Victor Langford directly across the hall, and she let herself feel for exactly 2 seconds every piece of what the last 6 weeks had been. The 3 in the morning arithmetic, the ride to the boarding house in the dark, the ledgers, the letters, the land records spread across the study table, Torres coming through the front door with blood on his sleeve, the Hargroves at her kitchen table with hope and terror competing on their faces. 2 seconds. Then she turned back to Commissioner Hayes. "I have one more document," she said. She put it on the table. It was a letter. Not from a land office, not from a surveyor, not from an attorney. It was from the First Territorial Bank of Casper. Specifically from a loan officer named Walter Geddes, who had submitted a voluntary statement to the Territorial Marshal's office 4 days ago. Abigail had moved very quietly on this, had asked Colt's Cheyenne attorney to make the approach without her name attached, detailing a series of conversations in which he had been instructed by an outside party to call specific loans at specific times, and to document the reasons as routine risk review. The outside party was identified in the statement by name. Hayes read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up at the room and at Langford's table and at Abigail. "Mrs. Walker," he said carefully, "this letter constitutes a direct witness statement implicating Mr. Langford in deliberate loan manipulation." "Yes," she said. "When was this submitted to the Marshal's office?" 4 days ago. "And you have a copy of the Marshal's receipt?" She placed it on the table. "I do." Calder was on his feet. Hayes didn't even look at him. "Sit down, Mr. Calder," Hayes said, and his voice had changed, gone flat and official in the way that meant the pleasantries of procedure were finished. "Mr. Langford." He looked at Langford directly. "I am going to recess this hearing for 45 minutes. During that time, I will be speaking privately with the Territorial Marshal's representative, who I believe is in attendance today." A slight pause. "I strongly advise you to consult with your counsel." Langford's face had changed. Not broken, not panicked. Men like Langford didn't panic, but something had left it the comfortable certainty, the settled weight of a man who had never genuinely expected to lose. He was calculating. Abigail could see it. Running the numbers the way she'd run numbers at 3 in the morning, and arriving at the same place she'd arrived. The place where the math didn't work out. She sat down. Colt was beside her. He leaned slightly toward her and said very quietly, "Walter Geddes." "He reached out through your attorney," she said at the same volume. "3 weeks ago. He wanted to talk." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want you to carry it until I knew it was solid." She kept her eyes on the commissioner's table. "It's solid." A pause. "Abigail," he said. That was extraordinary." She straightened her remaining documents into a neat stack. "We're not done yet." The recess lasted 55 minutes, not 45. Abigail sat at the table and drank water and did not go anywhere or speak to anyone except the Hargroves and the Martins who came forward during the break. Clara Hargrove put her hand over Abigail's on the table and didn't say anything, and Abigail didn't say anything back because some moments didn't need words. When Hayes returned, 2 men came with him. One was the territorial marshal's deputy, which had been expected. The other was a man Abigail didn't recognize, middle-aged formal coat, carrying a case that had the look of a government attorney's case. Langford's posture changed when he saw that second man, almost imperceptibly. The kind of change that only registers if you've been watching for it. Abigail had been watching for it. Hayes called the room to order. "This commission has reviewed the statement submitted to the marshal's office and finds it material to this proceeding," he said. "Given its content, this commission is obligated to refer the matter of the land acquisitions involving the Hargrove Martin Calloway Webb Denton Rourke and Prater properties to the Territorial Court for formal review." He looked at Langford. "The railroad route determination for the Southern Corridor is suspended pending that review, as the land parcels proposed for the route cannot be committed under circumstances of contested acquisition." Calder stood immediately. "Commissioner, my client's proposal involves parcels that are legally—" "That is a determination for the Territorial Court, Mr. Calder," Hayes said. "Not this commission." He gathered his papers. "This hearing is adjourned." The room erupted. Not violently. The sound that came from 200 people was something harder to describe than noise. It was release. The exhale of people who had been holding something for years and had finally, in this ordinary hall on a Thursday morning, been given permission to set it down. Abigail sat still in the middle of it. She heard Langford's voice behind her, controlled and sharp, directed at Calder. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She could read the shape of them from the way Calder's shoulders hunched forward and the way Langford's hand came down flat on the table between them with a sound that cut briefly through the room noise. Then she heard Eleanor Langford. She hadn't expected that. Eleanor had been seated behind her father throughout the proceedings, and Abigail had not looked at her once, which had been deliberate. But Eleanor came around the table now and stopped in front of Abigail, and her face was not what Abigail expected. Not fury. Not the careful cruelty of their exchange in town. Something rawer than that. "Did you know," Eleanor said, "when you started this? Did you know how far it would go?" It was not quite a question. "Yes," Abigail said. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Her jaw moved. "My father—" She stopped. "I know it's your father," Abigail said, and she said it without satisfaction, because Eleanor Langford had not stolen anyone's land, and whatever else she was also a daughter standing in a hall watching her world contract. "I'm sorry for the part of this that falls on you." Eleanor looked at her. Something crossed her face, complicated and unresolved. Then she straightened, gathered herself with visible effort, and walked out. Abigail watched her go. Colt's hand came down briefly on her shoulder. One touch. Then he was standing to speak to the Hargroves and the Martins, who had found each other in the crowd, and were shaking hands with the slightly stunned quality of people who had expected to fight and had won instead. Outside afterward in the cooling afternoon air, The crowd milled slowly, and the conversations were the kind that start after something shifts. Speculative animated people, recalculating what they thought they knew about the valley and who ran it. Abigail stood at the side of the building with Colt and let the noise move around them. She was very tired. The particular bone-level tired that comes after you've been running on, will and cold coffee for weeks, and the thing you were moving toward has finally arrived. Langford won't go quietly, Colt said. No. His attorneys will fight the court review. It'll take months, maybe longer. But the railroad contract is gone. The railroad contract is gone, she said. That's the piece that hurts him most. He built the last 2 years of acquisitions around that contract. Without it, the eastern parcels he's been buying don't generate the return he planned for. He'll be liquid short by spring. Colt looked at her. How do you know that? His land acquisition pace in the last 18 months, she said. He was moving faster than his cash flow supports unless the railroad deal closes. I ran the numbers last week. She paused. He overextended himself. He thought the deal was certain. A beat. You didn't tell me that either, he said. I wanted to be sure first. He shook his head slowly, not in frustration, in something closer to wonder. Colt, she said. Yes, the families. The ones who lost land. The court review will take time, but if the acquisitions are invalidated, they'd have standing to reclaim their properties, he said, or compensation if the land's been developed. He paused. I'll talk to the Cheyenne attorney. We should offer to cover their legal costs through the court process. All 7 families. She looked at him. That's going to be expensive, she said. Yes, he said simply. It is. She held that for a moment. The man who wore worn boots and worked beside his ranch hands and knew every employee by name and their families too, who had spent 11 years building an empire and never once used it to make anyone feel small. When we get home, she said, I want to send letters to all 7 families tonight, before the rumors get ahead of us. They should hear directly from us what the next steps are. Tonight, he agreed. And I want to send a letter to my mother, of course. And one to my father. He looked at her. The mention of Thomas Turner carried everything. It always carried the worry, the tenderness, the particular grief of watching a parent diminish. He'd met Thomas only once briefly, but he'd written him a letter 2 weeks into the marriage that Abigail hadn't known about until her mother mentioned it. A straightforward letter Thomas had told her later. Just a man writing to his father-in-law to say his daughter was well and the land was safe. Thomas had kept it. How is he? Colt asked. Mama says he's been sitting up more, she said. The doctor thinks the summer air helped. We should have them come out, he said. Not a visit. Come and stay. She looked at him. The estate. It's your home, he said. It came out matter-of-fact the way he said things that he'd already decided. Your family is welcome in your home. She felt the word land differently than it had when Ruth first spoke it that first day in the entryway. Mrs. Walker. Welcome to the estate. She'd heard it as formal then. Transactional. The acknowledgement of a legal arrangement. She heard it differently now. She looked out at the crowd, still moving through the afternoon light at the Hargroves, talking with the Martins at Pete from the ranch crew who had driven in for the hearing, and was now in animated conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize at the ordinary complicated people of a valley that was slowly tilting back towards something fairer. Colt, she said. Yes. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she'd been learning to do without flinching. When we get home, she said, I want to talk about the 6-month agreement. He went very still. The 6-month arrangement. The document they'd both signed at the boarding house table, 2 strangers negotiating the terms of something neither of them had words for yet. She had not mentioned it since the day of the wedding. He had not mentioned it at all. All right, he said carefully. It expires in 3 weeks, she said. I know. She held his gaze. I don't want to wait 3 weeks to have the conversation. Something moved through his face, a sequence she watched happen in real time. Caution. Hope. The careful effort of a man who had been precise and deliberate about hope for a very long time, because he had learned that hope unprotected was the most expensive thing a person could carry. "What do you want to say?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things. "I want to say that I came into this arrangement looking for an exit," she said. "And at some point, I don't know exactly when I stopped looking." He said nothing. "I want to say that the past 6 weeks have been the first time in my life that someone treated my mind as an asset rather than an inconvenience," she said. "And that matters to me more than I expected it to." Still nothing. He was listening with his whole self, the way he did when something mattered, and not filling the space. "And I want to say," she said, "that I think we should tear up the agreement." A pause. "And replace it with what?" he said. She looked at him. "Something that doesn't have an expiration date." The afternoon light was long and flat, and the crowd moved around them, and nobody was paying them any particular attention. Two people standing at the side of a building in the ordinary aftermath of an extraordinary morning. Colt looked at her for a long time. "Abigail," he said. "Yes, I have been in love with you," he said slowly and deliberately. "Since the morning you walked into my study at midnight and told me my accounts receivable were 40 days behind." She felt it go through her, warm and certain, and entirely unsurprising, which was perhaps the most surprising part. As though some part of her had known for weeks and had simply been waiting for the words to make it official. "That was 9 in the evening," she said, "not midnight." The corner of his mouth moved. The almost smile that she had catalogued over 6 weeks with the same attention he'd given to 24 words over 6 years. "9 in the evening," he agreed. She reached out and put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around it. They stood there together in the afternoon light, while the valley shifted around them, and the evidence sat in folders on a table inside, and 7 families began the slow process of getting back what had been taken. And everything that had started with a foreclosure notice and a stranger in a dusty yard was still moving forward towards something neither of them had been able to name at the beginning. They were beginning to be able to name it now. 3 weeks after the hearing, Victor Langford's lead attorney filed a formal challenge with the territorial court. Abigail read the filing at the kitchen table over her morning coffee and set it down and picked it up again, because the first read had made her certain she'd misunderstood something. She hadn't. Calder had found a procedural angle, narrow and technical, concerning the chain of custody on the Laramie County document that he'd challenged during the hearing, and he was using it to argue that Hayes's referral to the territorial court had been premature and should be vacated, pending a review of the evidentiary record. It was not a strong argument, but it was a real one. She brought it to Colt at breakfast. He read it once, set it down. "He's buying time," he said. "Yes, and if he gets the referral vacated, we have to start the court process from the beginning." She poured his coffee without thinking about it. The automatic ease of a woman who had been sharing a kitchen with someone long enough for the small rituals to form on their own. "Calder knows the document is valid. This isn't about winning the argument. It's about exhausting us." "Can he win it?" "No," she said. "The certification from the Laramie archivist is clean. But the challenge will sit in review for 60 to 90 days, during which time Langford's obligations on the eastern parcels continue to accrue. He's bleeding money." She sat down across from him. "Which means he's going to do something else." Colt looked at her over his coffee. "What?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what worries me." The something else arrived 4 days later, and it came from a direction Abigail hadn't anticipated. Margaret Turner appeared at the estate on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not unusual. She had been coming twice a week since the hearing, making the trip with the hired man Colt had assigned to check on the family property. What was unusual was the look on her face when she came through the front door. Not her ordinary combination of quiet worry and careful optimism. Something sharper. Something that had happened recently and was still happening. "Mama," Abigail said immediately. "What's wrong?" Margaret sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands and looked at them for a moment. "A man came to the house yesterday," she said. "He said he represented a land investment company. He wanted to buy the ranch. Abigail went very still. What company? He had a card. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and put it on the table. Western Valley Property Associates. The name had changed. The structure hadn't. Abigail picked up this card, turned it over. The registered address on the back was in Cheyenne. She knew, without checking, that if she traced it, it would route back through the same network of shell companies she had spent weeks mapping. Langford hadn't bothered to build a new architecture. He'd just changed the nameplate. What did you tell him? Abigail asked. I told him the property wasn't for sale, Margaret said. He said to think about it, that the offer was time-sensitive. She paused. He was very polite. That's what frightened me. He was polite because he's done this before, Abigail said. Polite and time-sensitive is the combination they use right before they find a pressure point. She set the card down flat on the table. Mama, has anyone from the bank contacted you recently? Any letters, any notices? There was a letter last week, Margaret said. From the bank. I thought it was routine, something about the loan terms, an annual review. Do you have it? Margaret reached into her coat again. Abigail read it standing up, one hand braced on the table. It was dressed as a routine communication. Annual interest rate adjustment standard language. Nothing on the surface that looked like a threat. But buried in the third paragraph in the particular legal phrasing that banks used when they wanted to create an option without appearing to was a clause about accelerated repayment terms under specific property valuation changes. She set the letter down. He's going after the family ranch, she said. He can't touch us directly anymore, not after the hearing, so he's going around. She looked at her mother. He's trying to force a sale of your property, which sits between two of his eastern parcels. If he gets it, he still controls enough of the valley corridor to make a railroad argument even without the Walker water rights. Margaret was watching her daughter with an expression Abigail had seen before, but rarely the combination of fear and fierce, complicated pride that mothers wear when they realize their child has grown into something larger than they knew how to prepare them for. What do we do? Margaret asked. We transfer the deed, Abigail said. To who? To us, she said. The Walker estate. It's a legal property transfer between family members, completely clean, and it removes the leverage entirely because we don't carry debt. She was already moving toward the study. I'll have the paperwork drafted today. Colt's attorney can file it by end of week. She stopped in the doorway and turned back. Mama, she said. I should have done this 6 weeks ago. I'm sorry. Margaret looked at her for a moment. You were a little busy, she said quietly. Colt had the transfer filed in 4 days, which was faster than Abigail had thought possible, and which told her he'd put pressure on the Cheyenne office, in a way he hadn't mentioned to her. She didn't bring it up. She understood by now that there were things he moved on quietly the same way she did, and that the appropriate response was not to interrogate his methods, but to note the result and trust the pattern. The result was that the Turner family ranch was now legally part of the Walker estate before Western Valley Property Associates could make a second approach. When Abigail told her mother, Margaret sat down and pressed both hands flat on her knees and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright. Your father, she said. He needs to know. I know, Abigail said. I want to bring him here. Margaret looked up. Here the journey would be. Colt had a proper wagon fitted with cushions last week, Abigail said. He arranged it without telling me until it was done. She paused. Bring Daddy here. Let him see what's been built. Let him see. She stopped, gathered herself. Let him see that everything is all right. Dice. Thomas Turner arrived at the estate on a Saturday in late September, which had turned cool and gold the way Wyoming Septembers do. And the journey had tired him, but not broken him. And when the wagon came through the iron gates and he saw what lay beyond them, he was quiet for a very long time. Abigail was watching his face. She had been watching it her whole life, the lean, careful face of a man who didn't show things easily, who had taught her by example that feelings were real and important and best expressed through action rather than declaration. She had inherited that from him entirely and had spent her adult life wondering if it was a gift or a limitation. She watched him take in the estate. He didn't speak for almost 2 minutes. Then he said in a voice roughened by weeks of coughing and something else that had nothing to do with illness, "Abigail. Daddy, this is yours." "It's ours," she said. "Mine and Colt's." He looked at her. "Are you happy?" She considered it the way she considered everything honestly, without performing the answer. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was thin, but firm. "Good," he said, simply, finally, as though that single word settled something he'd been carrying since the morning the foreclosure notice went up. Colt met Thomas at the front of the house, and what passed between them in those first minutes was not the formal negotiation of a man greeting his father-in-law for the first time in a real way, but something quieter and more direct. Colt shook Thomas's hand and held it a beat longer than a handshake required, and said, "I'm glad you're here, sir." And Thomas looked at him with the assessing eyes of a man who had spent 50 years reading other men's intentions, and then nodded once. It was, Abigail thought, the male equivalent of Clara Hargrove putting her hand over hers at the courthouse table. The particular communication of people who didn't have many words, but meant the ones they used. She found herself smiling at nothing in particular. Ruth had prepared enough food for twice the number of people present, which was Ruth's consistent response to any emotional occasion, and they ate at the long table with Margaret and Thomas and Pete, who had somehow ended up invited, and the afternoon moved in the loose, unhurried way of afternoons that aren't trying to accomplish anything. Then after dinner, Colt disappeared for 20 minutes. Abigail noticed. She noticed everything he did had been noticing for long enough that she'd stopped pretending otherwise to herself, and his absence from the table registered the same way. A familiar sound stopping registers not loudly, but precisely. He came back with an envelope. He set it on the table in front of her, without ceremony, without preamble, the way he always delivered things that mattered. She looked at it. Her name was on the front. Her full name. Abigail Walker. In his handwriting, which was plain and deliberate and looked exactly like him. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. She opened it. It was the 6-month agreement. The document they'd signed at the boarding house table, two strangers in a parlor, negotiating something neither of them had a real name for. She recognized her own signature at the bottom, slightly hurried the signature of a woman who had made a decision and was committing to it before she could think herself out of it. She looked up at him. "You said you wanted to tear it up," he said. She had said that. Standing outside the courthouse in the afternoon light with his hand around hers, she had said she wanted to tear it up and replace it with something that didn't have an expiration date. She looked back down at the document. "Colt," she said. "It's yours to do with," he said. "I mean that. Whatever you decide, the estate, the arrangement, all of it, it's yours. I'm not holding anything over you." Her mother made a very small sound across the table that she was clearly trying to suppress. Thomas was looking at the wall in the particular way he looked at walls when he was feeling something he wasn't going to show. Abigail held the document for a moment. She thought about the woman who had signed it. 26 years old, sitting in a straight-backed chair with her hat in her lap, running the arithmetic of a choice that felt like loss, even while she was making it. That woman had signed this document because she had no other option, and she had known it, and she had done it anyway for her mother and her father and the land her grandfather built. She thought about who she was now, the same woman, with the same stubbornness and the same practical mind and the same tendency to stay awake at 3 a.m. doing arithmetic. But those same qualities had built something here in this house, in this valley, alongside a man who had never once treated them as inconveniences. She thought about the accounts receivable, the Garrison contract, the Hargroves at her kitchen table, Torres in the doorway with blood on his sleeve, and her own voice coming out level when she was anything but. The study at midnight with documents spread across the table, and Colt beside her, not leading, not directing, simply present and trusting. She thought about, "I have been in love with you since the morning you walked into my study." 9 in the evening, she'd said. 9 in the evening, he'd agreed. She looked at her father. He had stopped looking at the wall and was looking at her, and his eyes held the thing he always tried to hide, and never quite managed the love of a man who had spent 30 years building something to pass on, and had nearly lost it, and had watched his daughter save it in a way he never could have imagined. She looked at her mother, who was not trying to hide anything at all. She looked at Colt. He was watching her with the steady, patient expression she had been cataloging for months. The expression that waited without pressure, that trusted her to arrive at the right place without being pushed there. That had been waiting, she understood now, for years before she'd ever walked into a boarding house parlor and held out her hand. She smiled. She tore the document in half. The sound it made was clean and small and final. She set the two halves on the table and looked at Colt and said, "I made my decision a long time ago. I just needed to make sure it was mine." The room was quiet for a moment. Then her mother made the sound she'd been trying to suppress. And this time she didn't try to suppress it. And Pete, who had no reason to be emotional about any of this, but had apparently been caught up in it anyway, suddenly found something very interesting to look at in his coffee cup. Thomas Turner reached across the table and put his hand briefly over his daughter's. Once. Firm. Colt reached across from the other side. His hand covered hers too. What followed was not an ending. Abigail had lived long enough to know that real life didn't end. It accumulated layer by layer, the way good soil builds over years. What followed was more of everything that had already been work and argument and late nights and problems that needed solving and the particular satisfaction of solving them. The territorial court took 11 weeks to clear the procedural challenge Calder had filed. When it cleared, the judge assigned to the case was a woman named Harriet Moore, which was unusual enough in the territory that people talked about it for weeks. Judge Moore had a reputation for following evidence without ceremony, which was what Abigail had been counting on since the moment she heard the appointment. The first hearing before Judge Moore lasted 2 days. Langford's attorneys fought on every document. Abigail sat at the plaintiff's table with the Cheyenne attorney and answered questions and presented supplementary records and cross-referenced dates with the patience of someone who had already done this once and knew that patience was the better weapon. Calder was technically brilliant, and she respected that about him, even while she was dismantling his arguments piece by piece. On the evening of the second day, Judge Moore recessed to review the evidence. She came back the following morning with a 20-page finding. The acquisitions of the Hargrove Martin Callaway Webb, Denton Rourke and Prater properties were invalidated. The survey documents used to manufacture the boundary disputes were referred to the territorial prosecutor for criminal fraud investigation. Gerald Pruitt was suspended from county employment pending that investigation. Walter Geddes, the bank loan officer, whose voluntary statement had been the linchpin of the hearing evidence, received immunity in exchange for his cooperation in the broader inquiry. Victor Langford was ordered to appear before the territorial prosecutor within 30 days. The eastern parcels, the ones he'd spent 3 years acquiring, the ones he'd overextended himself financially to secure, the ones that needed the Walker water rights, and the Turner family land, and the railroad contract to justify their cost, were frozen, pending the fraud determination. Without the railroad contract, without the water rights, without the Turner parcel, with his accounts under scrutiny, and 7 families with legal standing to sue for restitution. The empire that Victor Langford had built over 30 years began to come apart, not all at once, but in the way that over-leveraged things always come apart faster than expected once the first piece gives. The Hargroves got their land back in December. Abigail and Colt rode out to meet them on the property. On the first day, they took possession. A cold, clear morning, with frost still on the grass, and Daniel Hargrove walked the fence line of his own land for the first time in 3 years, with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the complicated thing that faces do when relief and grief mix and you can't separate them cleanly. Clara stood beside Abigail and watched him. "He walked this fence every morning for 20 years, Clara said. before they took it, every morning first thing. Abigail didn't say anything. She watched Daniel Hargrove walk his fence line. "You did this," Clara said. "We did this," Abigail said. "You came to that kitchen table knowing what it might cost you. I didn't do it alone." Clara looked at her. "You're going to be hard to argue with." "Yes," Abigail said. "I've been told." Clara laughed, a full, real laugh, the kind that happens when something long held has finally been released, and Abigail found herself laughing too, there in the cold morning air on someone else's reclaimed pasture, the kind of laugh that doesn't need an explanation and doesn't require one. The Martins came back to the territory in the spring. They stopped at the estate on their way to reclaim their property, and Frank Martin sat at the kitchen table where the Hargroves had sat and looked at Abigail with his tired, direct eyes. "I want to say something," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to," he said. "When your letter came, the first one through Colt's attorney before we knew what you'd found. My wife read it first, and she said there's a woman behind this letter. Not a lawyer, a woman." He paused. "She said we should go." Abigail thought about her own letter writing. The careful phrasing. A woman is asking, not a cattle baron. It might matter. It had mattered. "Tell her I said thank you," Abigail said. "You can tell her yourself," Frank said. "She'll be here Thursday." On a morning in late spring, with the valley fully green and the mountains carrying the last of the snowpack in bright strips against the blue, Thomas Turner sat on the porch of the Walker estate and watched the land spread out before him. He had been staying for 3 weeks. The mountain air agreed with him, the doctor's phrase careful and professional, which translated in plain terms to, he was better than he had been, though not as he had been, and nobody was making predictions. Thomas knew this and did not ask for predictions. He sat on the porch and watched the land and seemed in some fundamental way at peace with the arithmetic of his situation. Abigail sat beside him in the second chair. They had been sitting together for 20 minutes without speaking, which was something they'd always been able to do. She had inherited his comfort with silence the same way she'd inherited his stubbornness and his handwriting and his habit of running numbers in his head before he slept. "I want to ask you something," Thomas said. "Okay." "That first night, when you came home from the boarding house." He was still watching the valley. "You'd already decided." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. "What decided you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things. "He'd been counting," she said. 24 words over 6 years. He knew the exact number. She paused. A man who pays that much quiet attention to something, to someone, without ever pushing, without ever making it a burden on them. That kind of patience, that kind of care. She looked at the valley. "I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew it was real." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was like that," he said. "Quiet man, counted things, noticed things." A pause. "Your grandmother said she didn't understand why she married him for the first year. Then she said she understood she'd never once doubted she was safe." Abigail held that. "Is that how you feel?" Thomas asked. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." He nodded once. Looked at the valley. "Good," he said. Colt found her on the porch that evening after her father had gone in to rest, and the light was going long and orange across the valley floor. He came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair her father had vacated and put 1 cup where she could reach it. They sat in companionable silence for a while. "Your father asked me something today," Colt said. She looked at him. "What?" "He asked me why I built all this." He gestured a small motion that took in the estate and the land and everything beyond it. "He said most men build to show someone. He wanted to know who I was building to show." She waited. "I told him I didn't know when I started," Colt said. "I thought I was building for security. Then I thought I was building to prove something to myself. Then it became something I did because it was what I knew how to do, and it kept the loneliness at a distance." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "And then I told him that I know now, that I've known for a while." She looked at him directly. "What did you tell him?" she asked. He turned and met her eyes. "That I was building it for someone I hadn't met yet," he said. "Or had met and hadn't found the right words for." The valley went quiet around them. The day was ending the way Wyoming days end in late spring, gradually with full color not rushing itself. She thought about a piece of paper in two halves on a kitchen table. About a man who had counted 24 words over 6 years and never told her until it was relevant. About all the ways that care expressed itself quietly in action, in patience, in trust. "Colt," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. She said it directly without qualification, without the careful framing she put around things that mattered, because some things were better said plainly. He looked at her for a moment. The something that moved through his expression was not surprise. It was the look of a man receiving something he had hoped for long enough that hoping had become its own kind of discipline. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for a while." "Then why didn't you say anything?" "I was waiting for you to be sure," he said. "You don't say things you're not sure of." She held that. He was right. She didn't. "I'm sure," she said. "I know," he said again. She reached out, and he took her hand, and they sat together on the porch in the evening light of a life that neither of them had planned or predicted, watching the valley that was theirs, not by force, not by inheritance, not by the accident of wealth, but by the slow and deliberate choice to build something real together. Months later, long after the court proceedings had finished, and the Langford empire had been redistributed, parcel by parcel, back toward the families it had been stripped from, long after Gerald Pruitt had resigned from the county office, and Victor Langford had settled with the territorial prosecutor, in an agreement that stripped him of everything he'd accumulated through fraud, long after the valley had begun to resemble what it had been before. One man decided to take what wasn't his. Abigail Walker stood at the window of the study that had become as much hers as his, and looked out at the land that they had defended and the life that they had built and thought about what all of it had cost and what it had returned. She thought about a foreclosure notice still warm from the printer, about a stranger in a dusty yard with worn boots and steady eyes, about 24 words counted over 6 years, about the moment she'd understood that the man she had agreed to marry for survival was someone she would have chosen freely, given time and information and the particular wisdom that only arrives through living. She had come to this valley to save her family. She had stayed to save a valley. She had built in the process the only thing that had ever felt entirely like her own. Colt came into the study with the morning mail and set it on her desk and looked at her, looking out the window, and said, "What are you thinking?" She turned around. "I'm thinking," she said, "that the Garrison contract comes up for renewal next month, and we should negotiate a 15% volume increase before they raise their rates." He looked at her for one beat. Then he smiled, not the almost smile, not the corner of the mouth shift she'd cataloged for months. A full, real, uncalculated smile, the kind that happened when a man was too happy to manage his expression. "Good morning to you too," he said. She picked up her pen. "Sit down," she said. "We have work to do." He sat down. They had work to do. They always had work to do. That was the thing about building a life, rather than inheriting one. It didn't sit still and admire itself. It moved forward every morning with a problem to solve, and a person beside you who trusted you to solve it. That was the real secret of the valley. Not the mansion behind the iron gates. Not the fortune assembled over 11 years of quiet, deliberate labor. Not the victory in a government hall on a Thursday morning when a woman with a folder of documents stood up and told the truth until the room had no choice but to hear it. The real secret was simpler than any of that, and more durable, and entirely ordinary, in the way that the most important things always are. It was two people who chose each other, every day, on purpose, for the rest of their lives. That was enough. That was everything.